Somewhere in America right now, a retired couple is sitting in a single-wide home they own outright. No mortgage, no landlord telling them what to paint the walls. They worked for it, saved for it, and finally paid it off. And yet every single month, they still write a check to someone else, not for the house, but for the dirt underneath it. That's the strange, almost hidden secret of one of the most profitable corners of American real estate. You can own the house completely and still not own an inch of the ground it sits on. And here's the part that should really catch your attention. The person collecting that monthly check for the dirt might be pulling in returns higher than almost anywhere else in real estate, higher than apartment buildings, higher than office towers, higher than storage units. In the last 30 years, this quiet, unglamorous business has turned ordinary investors into millionaires and made billionaires even richer. Warren Buffett is in it. The late Sam Zell, one of the most feared deal-makers in American history, called it the best investment he ever made. Private equity firms with hundreds of billions of dollars under management have poured money into it, and yet almost nobody talks about it at dinner parties because it doesn't sound glamorous. It sounds like something out of a stereotype, a trailer park. But strip away the stereotype, and what's left is one of the most ruthlessly efficient business models in modern real estate. Today we're going to take that model apart, piece by piece. We'll trace where it came from, why it became a magnet for some of the richest people on Earth, how the math actually works, and why, for the people living inside these communities, this same business model has become the center of a national controversy. By the end, you'll understand exactly why so many investors want in, and exactly what that wanting costs someone else.
Let's start with the basic mechanics, because most people get this wrong immediately. A mobile home park, increasingly called a manufactured housing community in the industry because trailer park carries decades of stigma, isn't really in the business of owning homes. In most parks, the resident owns their own home outright. What the park owner owns is the land underneath it, along with the roads, the water lines, the sewer connections, and the electrical infrastructure that keeps the whole community running. The resident pays what's called lot rent, a monthly fee for the right to keep their home parked on that plot of land and plugged into those utilities. As of 2026, that lot rent averages somewhere between $450 and $700 a month across the country, with some high-demand markets in the Sun Belt pushing past that, and some tighter, older communities in the Midwest and South closer to the $300 to $450 range. Compare that to a typical apartment rent in the same city, and you could start to see why more than 22 million Americans currently call a manufactured home their primary residence. Here's the twist that makes this business model genuinely unusual, and it's the single most important thing to understand before anything else makes sense. The word mobile in mobile home is, for almost all practical purposes, a myth. According to industry data, over 80% of manufactured homes never leave the lot they were first placed on. Moving one of these homes isn't like hooking up a trailer and driving off. It requires a specialized, permitted transport company, often costs somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000, and carries a real risk of structural damage to a home that likely cost far less than that to begin with. For most residents, moving isn't a real option, it's a theoretical one. And that single fact that the home is functionally immobile, even though it's legally called mobile, is the hinge on which this entire industry turns. Because once a resident places their home on a lot, they are, in almost every practical sense, locked in. If the lot rent goes up next year and the year after that, most residents have no meaningful alternative but to pay it. That dynamic alone explains almost everything you're about to hear about why this asset class became so attractive to sophisticated investors.
To understand how we got here, we have to go back more than a century, to a time when nobody was thinking about real estate investment at all. They were thinking about cars. In 1913, in the small border town of Douglas, Arizona, the United States opened its first municipal auto camp, a patch of land where early automobile travelers could park their vehicles and pitch camp for the night. This wasn't housing, it was the birth of American road tourism.
driven by a new invention that was reshaping how people moved through the country. As car ownership exploded through the 19-teens and 1920s, enterprising landowners, often farmers with spare acreage, began roping off sections of their property and charging travelers a small fee to park overnight. By the late 1920s, these simple camps had evolved into something more sophisticated. In 1929, a man named Arthur G. Sherman invested $10,000 to found the Covered Wagon Company, one of the first serious manufacturers of towable trailers. Then in 1936, a Los Angeles trailer builder named Wally Byam introduced something that would become an American icon, the Airstream Clipper, a sleek, riveted aluminum trailer that sold for $1,200, roughly $30,000 in today's money. These were built for travel and leisure. Nobody was living in them full-time. Not yet. Then came the Great Depression, and everything changed. When the stock market collapsed in 1929 and millions of Americans lost their homes, their farms, and their jobs, people began looking at these leisure trailers differently. If you could spend one night in one, some reasoned, why not 365? For the first time, trailers stopped being a vacation product and started becoming a survival strategy, a cheap physical roof over your head when nothing else was affordable. It wasn't a large-scale shift yet because there simply weren't enough trailers in existence, but the idea had been planted. The real explosion came with World War II. The federal government suddenly needed to house hundreds of thousands of war workers and military personnel almost overnight, and there was no time to build conventional housing fast enough. Between 1940 and 1945, the U.S. government ordered more than 150,000 trailer units, essentially inventing the modern manufactured housing industry through sheer wartime demand. When the war ended and millions of soldiers came home needing somewhere to live immediately, the number of dedicated trailer communities in America rocketed from around 820 in 1945 to more than 3,000 by 1953. What started as an emergency wartime fix had become permanent infrastructure. But permanence brought a new problem: reputation. Many post-war city planners saw these communities as undesirable and deliberately zoned them into the least desirable corners of town, next to junkyards, freeways, and industrial land. That decision, made largely in the 1940s and 1950s, planted a stigma that the industry has never fully shaken off, even as the product itself changed dramatically. In 1976, the federal government stepped in decisively. The newly formed Department of Housing and Urban Development began enforcing a national building code for these homes, and every unit built after that date had to carry a HUD certification label. That regulatory shift is exactly why the industry insists on the term manufactured home today. These are no longer flimsy trailers, they're factory-built houses, engineered to code, installed on permanent foundations, and often indistinguishable from a site-built home once you're standing inside one. So how did a stigmatized housing type from the Depression era become one of the hottest real estate asset classes of the 21st century? The answer is entirely about the numbers, and once you see them laid out, it's hard to unsee why so much capital is rushed in. Start with supply. New mobile home parks are almost never built anymore. Restrictive zoning laws in most municipalities make it extraordinarily difficult to get approval for a brand new community. And even when approval exists, the land is often more profitable developed to something else: retail, apartments, single-family subdivisions. The result is that the total number of lots in America has stayed essentially flat for decades, even while demand for affordable housing has climbed. In economics, that combination, fixed supply, rising demand, is the exact recipe for pricing power, and park owners have used it. National average lot rent rose roughly 7.3% in a single year between 2023 and 2024, reaching close to $746 a month entering 2025, according to data from institutional property advisors, a pace of growth that dramatically outstrips general inflation. Now layer in occupancy. A decade ago, average occupancy across mobile home parks nationally sat around 86.5%.
By 2026, that number has climbed to nearly 94%, meaning almost every available lot in the country is filled, and empty lots are becoming rare enough that vacancy itself has become a competitive advantage for buyers hunting for value-add deals. In tighter regional markets like the Pacific states, vacancy can fall to around 1%. That's not a housing market with room to breathe. That's a housing market operating at close to full capacity, which pushes prices only one direction. Then there's the expense side of the ledger, and this is where the business model starts to look almost too good on paper. A professionally managed mobile home park typically runs an expense ratio of only 30 to 40% of gross income. Compare that to an apartment complex, where operating expenses routinely eat up 45 to 55% of revenue because owners are responsible for maintaining every unit's plumbing, appliances, roofing, and interior finishes. In a mobile home park, the park owner owns and maintains their own home. The park owner is typically only responsible for the land, the roads, and the shared utility infrastructure. That single structural difference, who pays to fix what breaks, is a large part of why mobile home parks can generate cash flow margins that make apartment investors jealous.
And then there's the number that turns casual investors into obsessives: the return on capital. According to industry analysis published in 2025, mobile home park investments have produced a remarkable average annual compounded return of around 22%, a figure that tops virtually every other category of real estate investment, including multifamily apartments, office space, retail, and industrial. Capitalization rates, essentially the annual return an investor gets relative to the purchase price, typically range from 4 to 7% for premium, well-run communities, and can stretch to 8, even 10 to 12% for older, undermanaged mom-and-pop parks that a sophisticated buyer believes they can improve. That last category, the undermanaged park, is where the real fortune building happens. And it's worth explaining in detail because it's the engine behind almost every major success story in this industry. Picture a 100-lot park, still run by an elderly couple who bought it decades ago and never raised the rent to match the market. Their lot rent might be $300 a month when the market rate for a comparable park nearby is $475. A sophisticated buyer acquires that park, gradually, sometimes over 18 to 36 months, raises rents toward the market rate, fills any vacant lots, repairs aging water and sewer infrastructure to cut down on losses, and installs individual utility submetering so residents pay for their own water and electricity instead of the owner absorbing those costs across the whole property. Industry data suggests this kind of value-add strategy can produce net operating income growth of 30 to 60% within just 2 to 3 years. On a property valued using a capitalization rate, that kind of income growth translates directly into a dramatically higher resale value, sometimes doubling the investor's money well within a 5-year hold period. To make this concrete, take a 100-unit park in a mid-size American metro with 88 of its lots occupied and an average lot rent of $475. That's just over $41,000 in monthly rental income, or roughly $500,000 a year before even counting recaptured utility costs and other fees. On a deal like that, with the right financing, often through conventional bank loans, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac agency debt for larger stabilized parks, or seller financing for smaller acquisitions, an investor's return on their actual cash invested can run well into double digits annually, even before accounting for the appreciation in the park's resale value. Every under-the-radar industry has a handful of people who spot the opportunity years before everyone else. In mobile home parks, that story centers on one man who earned one of the more unforgettable nicknames in American business. Sam Zell was already a legend in commercial real estate by the time he turned his attention to mobile home parks in the mid-1990s. Born in 1941 to parents who had fled Poland just before the Nazi invasion, Zell built his fortune by doing the opposite of what everyone else was doing, buying up distressed office buildings and apartment complexes after the commercial property crash of the late 1970s, a habit that earned him the nickname the Grave Dancer. When Zell started buying mobile home parks in the 90s, almost nobody in serious finance took the sector seriously.
banks wouldn't lend against these properties. There was no institutional playbook. It was, in his own words, completely contrarian, exactly the kind of opportunity Zell had built his entire career chasing. What Zell did next changed the industry permanently. As he kept buying and kept succeeding, lenders started paying attention. If Sam Zell, one of the most respected dealmakers in the country, was willing to put his money into trailer parks, maybe they weren't as risky as everyone assumed. That single shift in perception unlocked institutional financing for the entire sector, including access to agency debt through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that simply hadn't existed for this asset class before. Through his publicly traded real estate investment trust, Equity Lifestyle Properties, Zell eventually built the largest portfolio of manufactured housing communities in the country, at one point controlling nearly 140,000 lots across more than 370 communities. And in a career built on buying and selling everything from office towers to newspapers, there was one asset class Zell reportedly never sold, even through the depths of the 2008 financial crisis: his mobile home parks. Before he passed away in 2023, Zell was still telling interviewers he didn't know of any property in his portfolio with a better long-term outlook. Zell wasn't operating in isolation. Around the same time, Warren Buffett was building a parallel empire from a completely different angle, not the land underneath the homes, but the homes themselves. In 2003, Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway paid $1.7 billion to acquire Clayton Homes, which has since grown into the largest manufacturer of manufactured housing in the United States, responsible for more than a quarter of all new manufactured homes built nationwide. But Buffett didn't stop at manufacturing. Through Clayton's financing arms, 21st Mortgage and Vanderbilt Mortgage, Berkshire also became one of the largest lenders to the very buyers purchasing those homes, meaning Buffett's companies could profit from building the home, selling the home, and financing the home, all in a single transaction. By 2018, Clayton Homes alone was generating over $900 million in pre-tax earnings annually. And then there's the pair whose names became almost synonymous with aggressive, ground-level mobile home park acquisition, Frank Rolfe and Dave Reynolds. Starting from much more modest beginnings than Zell or Buffett, the two built a portfolio across dozens of states, reportedly controlling tens of thousands of individual home sites, and eventually turned their playbook into a paid seminar business called Mobile Home University, teaching other investors how to replicate their acquisition and rent-raising strategy. Their success turned them into two of the most influential and, as you're about to hear, most controversial figures in the entire industry.
Every one of those success stories has a mirror image, and it belongs to the people living on the land these investors bought. In April 2019, the television host John Oliver dedicated an entire segment of his show, Last Week Tonight, to exposing what he called the darker side of this industry. He pointed out that more than 100,000 home sites, traditionally run by small family operators, had been bought up by major private equity firms, naming the Carlyle Group, TPG Capital, and Blackstone directly on air. His argument was blunt. The same immobility that makes this business so financially reliable for investors is precisely what strips residents of any real bargaining power. If you can't afford to move your home, and moving costs more than the home itself might be worth, you simply pay whatever the new owner decides to charge. The segment cited a specific case that made the abstract argument painfully concrete: a community called Plaza del Rey in California, acquired by Carlyle in 2015. According to reporting cited on the show, Carlyle raised lot rents there by roughly 8% annually after the purchase, compared to just 3% annual increases under the previous owner. Carlyle's stated justification was the cost of capital improvements to the property. Critics, including Oliver and housing advocates like Senator Elizabeth Warren, argued this was simply what happens when a business model's core profit engine is a captive customer base with nowhere else to go. Frank Rolfe, the very man whose seminars taught much of the industry how to execute this strategy, became a central figure in that same segment, and Oliver's criticism of him was sharp enough that Rolfe later said it generated actual death threats against him. In a subsequent interview, Rolfe didn't deny the core economics. He openly acknowledged that mobile home lot rents were, in his words, insanely low and could only go up, framing it not as exploitation, but simple market correction. That tension between this is just supply and demand and this is a captive population with no exit sits at the heart of nearly every controversy this industry has faced. The financing side of the business has drawn its own scrutiny. A 2015 investigation by the Seattle Times and BuzzFeed News into Clayton Homes lending practices found evidence of what the report described as predatory sales tactics, hidden fees, and interest rates that could exceed 15% on manufactured home loans, trapping some buyers in debt they had little realistic chance of repaying. One case, highlighted in later reporting, involved a woman reportedly told to sell blood plasma just to help cover her monthly loan payment. These aren't the acquisition-level economics we discussed earlier. They're a separate but connected layer of the same industry, where the financing of the home itself becomes another point of vulnerability for residents who often have limited access to conventional mortgage credit. Zooming out to the scale of the whole industry, research from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy found that institutional investors acquired roughly 20% of America's mobile home parks over an 8-year period, and current estimates put total corporate ownership of park sites at around 30% nationwide. That's a striking shift for a sector that within living memory was overwhelmingly made up of small, independent, family-run operators. It also means that for millions of residents, the identity of their landlord has quietly changed from a neighbor down the road to a financial institution managing the property from a spreadsheet in another city entirely.
But this isn't a story with only one direction of momentum. In some communities, residents have found a way to flip the entire equation. Take North Lamar Mobile Home Park in Austin, Texas, a 68-lot mobile home community with a largely low-income, majority Latino population. In 2015, the park was purchased by none other than Frank Rolfe and Dave Reynolds, the same investors whose strategies had made them famous. What followed was years of resistance, lawsuits, public protests, petitions, and direct appeals to their own lenders. The residents' goal wasn't just to slow rent increases, it was to buy the land out from under their own landlords entirely. After nearly a decade of organizing, the residents of North Lamar closed on a $6.26 million deal to purchase the park themselves, converting it into a resident-owned cooperative. North Lamar isn't an isolated miracle. Since 1984, more than 1,000 mobile home parks across the United States have converted to resident-owned cooperative structures, most commonly with support from nonprofit organizations that help residents secure financing to buy the land collectively. It's a genuinely different economic model. Instead of an outside investor capturing the rent growth we spent the last 20 minutes explaining, the residents themselves become the landowners, and any future rent increases essentially just move money from one resident pocket to the shared community fund, rather than out to a distant shareholder. A handful of states have gone further and passed right of first refusal laws, requiring park owners to notify residents before a sale and give them the opportunity to match any outside offer. But these laws remain the exception rather than the rule. Most states still offer residents no formal say at all when their community changes hands.
So where does that leave us? A mobile home park is, on paper, one of the simplest real estate investments imaginable. Buy the land, collect a lot rent, keep the roads paved and the water running. But underneath that simplicity sits one of the most powerful economic advantages any landlord can have: a tenant who in 8 cases out of 10 physically cannot leave. That single structural fact is the reason Sam Zell called this his best investment, the reason Warren Buffett built a vertically integrated empire around it, and the reason 22% average annual returns have pulled in everyone from small private syndicators to some of the largest private equity firms on the planet. It's also the exact same fact that turned this industry into the subject of a national television takedown, multiple lawsuits, and a growing resident ownership movement fighting to take that leverage back.
There's no simple villain in this story, and there's no simple hero either. There's just an asset class built on a structural imbalance, landowner on one side, an immobile homeowner on the other, and a growing number of people on both sides of that line who are starting to understand exactly how much power that imbalance really holds. The mobile home park isn't just a piece of real estate, it's a case study in what happens when an entire market is built around the fact that one side simply has nowhere else to go.